Hey everyone, I was recently thinking about building PCs, as you do, and I realised that powering our graphics cards has never been more complicated. That's because there's now 6 different ways of powering them, although admittedly some methods only apply to certain GPUs, so there are only 3 ways of powering NVIDIA's most powerful graphics cards, or 2 to 3 ways of powering AMD's cards and older NVIDIA cards. It's all a bit confusing though, so I wanted to shoot this video to unpick this completely confusing cable conundrum. So if I back up a bit and give a bit more background, there was a time when many graphics cards could be powered solely through the motherboard's PCIe slot. That's because this slot supplies up to 75 watts of power to the GPU, unless you had one of those dodgy RX 480 models that drew more than this and fried some people's motherboards. Yikes. I actually had an RX 480 card, but thankfully I never had that particular issue. But in general, motherboards can supply up to 75 watts of power to the card. That means if you had a card like the venerable GTX 1050 Ti, or a card like this actually, you wouldn't actually need any extra power because this card's TDP rating, essentially the maximum power they can draw, is 75 watts or below. You actually can still buy cards of this even today with the AMD RX 6400 springing to mind, but in general things have moved on from this because progress waits for no PC gamer. That's totally the quote. And so we all want more pixels, more texture, more frames, more shadows, and so graphics cards have got increasingly more powerful. Enter the PCIe power cable that would plug directly into the GPU from the power supply unit to deliver extra power to it. I mean, this has been around for almost 2 decades now, but my point is that there were more and more GPUs started requiring these because 75 watts of power just isn't enough anymore. This actually brought about an interesting shift in GPUs too, because around a decade ago, low-end and mid-range cards like the GTX 1050 Ti would just be powered by the motherboard slot, and only higher-end cards actually needed a separate PCIe cable. But nowadays, nearly all GPUs, even budget ones, need 1 or even 2 of these cables, and higher-end GPUs might actually need 3 separate ones of these, or even a new special cable that delivers so much power that it melts and breaks everything. Okay, that's a slight exaggeration, but I'll discuss that point more later on. My point here though is that there was a bit of a paradigm shift around a decade ago in terms of how often these separate cables were required due to our increasing expectations from PC games and so our GPUs. So that brings us on to powering our graphics card with a PCIe cable, which is directly plugged into the PSU. Some of these cables are just 6-pin ends, while some actually have 8 pins to provide a little bit of extra power to the graphics card. Or what some PSU makers do, like Corsair, is actually give you 6+2 end that allows you to either insert just the 6 pins or the full 8 pins into your GPU, whatever your graphics card needs. However, this cable can get a little complicated because sometimes it just has a single end on it, while other times it has another end on it. Most people call this a Y-splitter end or a pigtail connector. I call it the Devilspawn connector because it lulls PC builders into a false sense of security. For example, if you have an RX 6800 XT GPU that requires 2 PCI Express connectors to be plugged into it, you might think that you could use the Devilspawn connector and plug both ends of the same cable into your GPU, but you'd be wrong. Basically, a PCI Express cable like this supplies 150 watts in total, whether you use the pigtail connector or not. Actually, that's not 100% accurate, as I discussed in another video, but it's accurate enough for the purposes of this video. So if you were to try to power your RX 6800 XT card using a single cable and the 2 pigtail ends, you might only supply 225 watts of power to it, 75 watts from the motherboard PCI Express slot, and 150 watts from the actual cable. But because this card requires 300 watts of power, you might then be underpowering it, and so it might crash or freeze up when playing PC games. You might be wondering why this horrible Devilspawn cable exists then. Well, it's to power multiple lower power PCI Express devices. If you had 2 devices that needed 125 watts each, this would be perfect because the PCI Express slot delivers 75 watts and this cable would top up with an extra 50 watts of power to each device. But for modern GPUs, this cable often isn't sufficient, which brings us on to the third way to power our graphics cards, using multiple PCI Express cables. This is particularly important if your card's TDP is over 225 watts because otherwise you'd underpower it. You should make sure that you plug separate PCI Express cables into your PSU and then run these to your graphics card. This will then ensure much higher and more stable power delivery to your card, because you can then deliver at least 375 watts of power with 2 cables and at least 525 watts of power with 3 cables if you have a really high-end GPU. This is what I do with my own RX 6700 XT GPU, because while the TDP is borderline at 230 watts, I didn't want to risk potentially underpowering it if I was maxing out my card playing certain games. So I prefer to run multiple separate cables to it. There are 2 downsides here though. Firstly, not every PSU actually supports multiple PCI Express cables, and also running multiple pigtail cables all over your case looks really ugly because you have all these horrible Y-splitter ends pointlessly hanging around your case. As a result, some PSU makers will supply single cable connectors in the box, and you can then naturally use these for your PSU, and they look neater than running multiple Devilspawn cables to your GPU. But if these weren't supplied to you, you can sometimes buy extra cables directly from the PSU maker, or you can buy them from a reputable company like CableMod. Just be sure to avoid buying third-party PSU cables from a random no-name brand on Amazon. I actually purchased individually sleeved cables from Corsair which don't have the extra pigtail ends, so they look really nice inside my case. And that brings me on to the other issue that I mentioned. If your PSU only supports one PSU cable in total. If your GPU requires two PCI Express cables to be plugged in, well, what should you do? Well, there are sadly only two options here. You either need to change your PSU entirely, or you can explore undervolting your card. This is where you use the bundled software to make it run slightly slower than the rated speed. This can sometimes save a lot of power, meaning that you can then power it with a single PCI Express cable via the pigtail connector. It's probably worth trying this before buying a brand new PSU, to be honest. Just be sure to watch out for any crashes or freezes when gaming though. Right, so that covers off the three different ways of powering your GPUs so far, and what I've said applies to all AMD graphics cards and many NVIDIA cards up until the last few years when everything changed. NVIDIA had some concerns about how GPUs were previously powered, so starting with the 30 series of cards, they introduced a new 12-pin cable. Not all 30 series GPUs required this, just to be extra confusing, because it was dependent on the board partners too. But some of the 30 series required this, in which case a cable or an adapter was actually often included in the graphics card box. However, this proprietary 12-pin cable was kind of NVIDIA going rogue. It wasn't part of any standard. So in 2020, a new cable design got bundled into the ATX 3.0 and PCI Express 5.0 specs, ready for NVIDIA's upcoming 4.0 series launch. Yes, I'm talking about the new special melting cable. I mean, that's not the official name, it's actually known as the 12VHPWR cable, standing for the 12-volt power cable. This 16-pin cable is a beast, since it can supply up to 600 watts of power. That's more than many gaming laptops actually use in total, for example. However, when this first launched, there were a flood of stories online because some of these cables ended up melting or burning up. The first NVIDIA claimed that these were because of user error, saying that people were pushing them all the way into the graphics card slot. But this claim was kind of disproven. The issues are more due to design issues of this cable. As a result, ATX 3.1 was rolled out and they redesigned this cable a little bit, and this introduced the new 12-volt 2x6 connector. This is becoming a bit of a mouthful now. But this new cable has slightly shorter sensing pins and longer conductors inside. This means it's more likely to be plugged in properly, so the voltage is delivered in a way that's safe and avoids potentially melting issues for your GPU and things like that, we hope. It does seem to be safer in general, but there's not that many ATX 3.1 PSUs out there yet. For example, I recently purchased a new Corsair PSU and it's still stuck at the older ATX 3.0 standard and comes with the 12-volt power cable and not the newer 12-volt 2x6 one. Hopefully ATX 3.1 PSUs will become much more widespread soon though. Having a super expensive NVIDIA card that can melt away your hope streams and cache is never fun, of course. So it's kind of interesting really just how much powering our GPUs has changed in recent years. Even though this new 16-pin cable is part of a standard, really NVIDIA have been responsible for turning a simple process into something a bit confusing and scary. That's my view, but what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts either way down in the comments. I'll also go into more detail on how to power standard 6 or 8-pin GPUs in another video if you wanted to check that out, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please click the thumbs up button and please subscribe to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.